Hello, everyone. Welcome to just a brief kind of overview of a couple of different pedagogical strategies we'll be looking at for this kind of week. One is Weston and Cranston's instructional strategies, and this comes from 1986, and they've basically defined a popular taxonomy that relates instructional strategies to different types of learning content and then domain content levels. So they have different strategies are viewed as useful for different types of contents and learning outcomes and so forth. Because, for those of us who are preparing to teach either at the elementary or secondary ed levels, but even in college, you still want to be aware of a couple of different kind of pedagogical approaches and methods, when you are building lectures and so forth. So they kind of divided again between, domain and then level and then method. So there's a cognitive domain, affect domain, and then psychomotor domain. And when you look at it, that's kind of a pretty clear distinction between how we accumulate knowledge, right? Is it through thought-based ideas? Is it through emotional aspects? Or is it through skills, right? So they divide it between, of course, knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, evaluation, right? All the what we call critical thinking skills. And then, of course, all the kind of emotional responses, what we value, what we respond to, how we feel about things, right? And then the psychomotor, of course, perceptions, mechanisms, right? Dexterity, all sorts of kind of skills that require some sort of demonstration or practice, right? So game playing and things like that. And if you're interested in learning more, this is the pretty much the article that it comes from, and then of course they wrote books on these ideas too. But it's selecting instructional strategies, and this will be just a kind of a good overview of terms of figuring out, okay, what do I want my students to think about? What do I want my students to respond to? And then what do I want my students to do, right? Actually, what the output is during a class session. Then in 1998, because of course, things moving to online and so forth, Root Clark uh, discussed that there are four potential kind of instructional archetypes. There's receptive, directive, guided and discovery, and then exploratory, right? So that pretty much these four exist, which teachers should use depending on available technology and resources for online courses. So, receptive instruction is characterized by a lecture or an internet site where where students are merely provided the information, right? They just receive it. Directive instruction is characterized by a computer-based tutorial where information is presented, the student's response, feedback is provided. And then guided discovery is, of course, some kind of like computer simulation or so forth, right? That allows students to manipulate some of the device or the environment. And then exploratory instruction is characterized by an open learning environment in which the students is provided a rich network database of information, examples, demonstrations, exercises, and so forth, right? Which students, of course, select whatever is appropriate to their current needs. Models and so forth. So I think of like Quizlet and so forth. That kind of stems from kind of Clark's ideas. And again, this comes from building expertise, cognitive methods for training and performance improvement. So the last one is an important one that has a lot of ramifications in terms of modern teaching, and this is Benjamin Bloom in Bloom's taxonomy. So he didn't create it by himself. He created it with a bunch of educators, but of course he's the one who published, and he was the one who was famous at the time, so it became him, right? So his taxonomy is basically trying to figure out how we learn, process, and reproduce information. So his taxonomy is considered one of the most important ones for thinking about how we teach students, but also how we learn. So it starts with just remembering, right? So what are the facts, right? I need to know in order to pass a quiz, pass a test, or so forth. What do I need to know in terms of facts and concepts to be just informed about the field of study? The second realm is then understanding those concepts. So yeah, I could tell you that the sky is blue. That's fact, right? I could get that, but then how do I explain it? Can I explain why the sky is blue? Do I understand the ideas behind it? And you can look at it in terms of the ideas that you're doing, right? So when you're in just the first stage of learning, what are you doing? You're defining, you're duplicating, you're listing, you're memorizing, right? In this stage, you're classifying, you're explaining, you're identifying, right? You're figuring out the kind of subtle nuances between ideas. The second one is applying information. So now, like an essay writing or so forth, right? Can I use this information in different situations? So if I am talking about Marxist criticism, all of a sudden, if I'm in a discussion about politics, can I actually apply what I've learned, right? And what I understand? The next stage is, of course, drawing connections. So this is the analytical stage where all of a sudden you're making connections to whether it's previous knowledge or things that you've learned in the past or things that you're learning currently, but now you're drawing connections. So think about any time where if you've been in class where I was like, oh, I remember that idea and I understand it from a different class. Now I could apply it in a different way or a different field of study, right? And so that goes into all these things. So you could organize, relate, compare and contrast different ideas. Think about too with our theories, right? Understanding the differences between, what Marx is arguing versus what Lenin's arguing under Marxist criticism, right? Those are the analytical aspects. And then you could start evaluating, right? That's basically what Bloom argues is the second, or excuse me, the second to last kind of idea, where if you've mastered all these functions, now you could start arguing with others about what's better or worse, right? So was Marx better than Lenin? Was Judith Butler smarter than Virginia Woolf? Like that's when you start evaluating. You could make clear judgments and you can make academically sound judgments, logical judgments, right? And then, of course, you're ready to create your own work, right? Can you create, based on all of these stages, can now you produce an original work that shows that you can evaluate, analyze, apply, understand, and remember all the different concepts at play, right? So it's an important aspect because that's kind of how we structure college level learning, right? And learning throughout multiple kind of years, right, of your study. So it's an important aspect of learning, an important aspect of teaching, right? Because then what do I want students to remember? What do I want students to understand? What do I want students to apply and analyze, evaluate, create, and so forth? So it's a really good kind of way that we could think about how people learn in order to teach better. And so a lot of times as learners, you could think about this taxonomy, but also most importantly, what does he want us to think about is how we could use this taxonomy to be better teachers, right? To really understand the needs. And as his book says, right, the classification of educational goals. How do we recognize if a student is learning or not, right? If the student really can figure out problems or not. And so these kind of aspects are really important to think about as teachers, especially for those of us who are going to be future teachers, how to plan courses, how to plan lesson plans, how to figure out and navigate all the different kind of minds and personalities you have in a classroom. And these are just a few. There are many more, but these are really three kind of important pedagogical approaches that you could use to really benefit students in any kind of class. And again, this is not just for literature, it's for all types of fields, but we'll be applying these ideas to kind of teaching literature. Obviously, if you have any questions, always post in Canvas in the forum. If not, best of luck with all the other assignments and take care.